when Ukraine pulled off a move that Vladimir Putin never saw coming. While guests were arriving at a multi-million-dollar guest house, something far smaller and far cheaper slipped through the darkness. Just a few plastic drones. Russian commanders even joked about them, branding the 6 Ukrainian Beaver drones as cheap and pointless. But minutes later, that laughter vanished. What happened next stunned Russia and rewrote the rules of modern warfare. And that's only half the story, because in the second half of this video, we're breaking down another unbelievable Ukrainian operation that crippled a billion-dollar Russian military aircraft. Russian commanders who stayed in Putin's guest house called the 6 Ukrainian Beaver drones cheap and laughed about them. But what happened next shocked them. So stay with us, because the next moments will leave you speechless. At 19:30 Moscow time, on the evening of September 21st, 2025, warm lights spill from a luxurious guest house in Crimea overlooking the Black Sea, and a private event for Russia's elite moves from toast to toast, as if the war is far away. The script frames the venue as more than a resort. The 40 Sanatorium, near the Foros Cliffs, sits beside state-owned dachas linked to security planning, the kind of place where comfort and command share the same corridors. Conversation and soft music hide that decisions made here ripple across ports and trenches, and the script signals this night will be measured by seconds, not speeches. That assumption is the opening weakness. Miles out on dark water, a low-silhouette unmanned surface vessel slices through the swells with a fiberglass hull designed to slip through waves and keep its radar return faint. It is identified as a Magura 5 drone boat, acting as a mothership rather than the main weapon. Inside its bay sit 6 OSA first-person view drones, compact and sorted, each built to sprint the last stretch. The boat's purpose is to bring them close without announcing its presence, turning distance into a false comfort. It stays far enough from shore to seem irrelevant, yet close enough that a minor course change becomes danger, with the sea surface acting as a mask for motion. The payload is described with clinical specificity. Each OSA drone carries a 1.5-pound shaped charge, intended to form a superheated jet of metal on detonation, concentrating force for penetration rather than blast. The script compares the effect to punching through concrete and steel as if they were paper, and later extends that threat to armored glass and vehicles. In this story, the warhead is not presented as a statistic, but as a promise, the kind of compact violence that makes defenders pay for every second of delay. The narration dwells on focus over spectacle, using the shaped charge detail to foreshadow how prestige architecture can fail when struck at the right point. The target selection is framed as strategic theater with practical consequences. The sanatorium is called a private playground for war criminals and planners, positioned near facilities associated with the Federal Security Service, where new waves of secret plans are imagined and refined. Striking it is not only about humiliation at a banquet table. It is tied to blinding the coastal network and protecting Ukraine's grain corridor, the export lane whose safety determines whether the economy breathes. By linking the venue to planning and surveillance, the story ties the strike to maritime security, implying that a blind coastline can widen the grain corridor. At 1931 local time, roughly 3 miles from the Crimean coast, the Magura slows to a crawl, and the bay doors open as if the sea itself is exhaling. One by one, 6 dark shapes slip into the Black Sea, and the mothership provides a final laser guidance lock, measured in 10 seconds before withdrawing into shadow. The handoff is described as parental, the larger craft leaving the mission to its children, and the timing becomes the tension. Seconds of guidance, minutes of flight, and a coastline packed with eyes. The mothership's retreat reads as confidence because the most dangerous leg begins near land, where humans and sensors overlap, and there is no reset button. The OSA drones accelerate to 60 miles per hour and skim low enough to taste salt spray, but they do not travel in a straight line. The tactic is named the Ghost Chain, credited to Ukrainian intelligence, and it is built on misdirection. The lead drone releases a cloud of aluminum chaff, described as 500 strips, turning the radar picture into a blizzard of false targets. Behind that electronic snowstorm, the remaining drones tuck in close, using the chaff as a moving shield while they press toward the cliffs. The chaff is cheap metal doing expensive work, and the chain metaphor matters because each drone's survival depends on the one ahead, like shared camouflage. The script then compresses the coastline into a knife edge of exposure. The drones hug the base of the Foros cliffs, flying in the radar shadow of rock, and briefly pop off for only a few seconds and only a few feet before dropping back into darkness. That rhythm creates the sense of a heartbeat. Reveal, vanish, reveal, vanish. Each burst timed to clear a patrol boat ahead, without inviting a sustained lock. The sequence connects geology to tactics, turning the cliff line into a stealth corridor that cannot be moved or jammed. Each brief pop above the cliff shadow is a calculated risk, because a sustained rise could invite small arms, thermal optics, or a lock from a nearby battery. At 1932 local time, the physical world pushes back. A strong wind gust hits the swarm and punishes drone number 3, described as the one with a corroded antenna, and a small targeting error becomes a stability crisis. The scene cuts far away to a concrete bunker deep beneath Odessa, where an operator watches his display flicker and fights the controls manually while flying blind behind chaff and interference. The mission scale collapses into his fingertips because one unstable drone threatens the timing that keeps the rest hidden. Distance does not reduce pressure, it sharpens it because the operator feels the wind only through telemetry, and one bad correction could expose the swarm. On the shoreline, the defenders are shown as alert individuals rather than faceless systems. A Russian Spetsnaz operator sweeps the cliffs through a high-end thermal scope, looking for a flicker of heat, and the moment his routine patrol finds something, the story pivots. At 1927 local time, his scope flares on a fast, hot signature, and he raises a specialized drone gun that fires a focused beam of electromagnetic energy. The decoy drone's electronics are fried, it erupts in sparks, and it plunges into the sea as a clean, confident kill. The drone gun is presented as precise and modern, and the irony lands immediately. The one target he can see is the one Ukraine can afford to lose. That radioed victory becomes the trigger for a larger mistake. 30 seconds later, a radar screen at a Pantsir S1 battery near Yalta lights up, but the operators do not interpret 5 small drones. They see a single massive signature, exactly what the chaff cloud was designed to create, and the system labels it enemy with the confidence of automation. A surface-to-air missile is launched at enormous cost, accelerating toward the cloud and smashing into aluminum strips that were never alive to begin with. The flash convinces the crew they scored a direct hit, while the real attackers remain untouched and closer. The story stresses the mismatch between screens and reality, showing how automated certainty can be weaponized when humans follow a false picture. While attention fixes on that phantom, the Magura V5 plays its last diversion offshore, now about 10 miles out. It begins broadcasting a fake electronic signature meant to mimic a much larger vessel. And on a Russian patrol boat's screen, a new priority target appears at the worst possible time. Patrols turn seaward, drawn away from the shoreline, clearing the final path for the real swarm moving under the cliffs. The script binds this to the wider sea picture, where commercial routes and military assumptions overlap, and one false blip can redraw a patrol pattern in minutes. The diversion layers with the grain theme, placing commercial silhouettes and military deception in the same water, where seeming matters as much as being. Then the alarm network escalates again. Sirens are described sounding across Sevastopol at 1928 local time, and an Su-30 fighter jet rockets into the night, its afterburners tearing light into the sky as it races to intercept. The script frames the jet as a Mach 1.9 Predator, built to kill anything that flies, yet the drones deny it the fight it wants by splitting into multiple altitude profiles and pressing toward a no-fire zone near supposedly civilian dachas. The geometry becomes the weapon. Too many small threats, too close to sensitive space, too little time to sort them cleanly. It sets up the next dilemma. Near protected zones, defenders choose restraint or overreaction, and tension climbs. The Russian response shifts from speed to saturation as electronic warfare floods the air. A wide-area jamming blanket descends like an invisible storm, described as powerful enough to drown civilian radios and military links alike. In Odessa, operators watch control feeds fill with static, and for a moment the drones appear isolated, cut loose from human hands. The script leans into the pause, explaining that this is the instant many defenses expect machines to fail. Instead, the OSA drones slide into autonomy, ignoring the noise and relying on internal gyroscopes and inertial systems that feel every turn and dip. Navigation becomes instinctual rather than communicative, and accuracy remains high enough to matter, reinforcing the recurring idea that physics is harder to silence than signals. The defenders add muscle to interference. Along the cliffs, Spetsnaz teams deploy kinetic nets and open fire with thermal-guided machine guns, their tracers stitching the darkness where heat signatures flicker. One OSA drone disappears in a brief flower of fire against the rock face, reducing the swarm to 4. The narration does not mourn the loss, it counts it. 1 down, 4 to go, with time compressing into a countdown that matters more than totals. Each surviving drone now carries more responsibility because the formation's geometry must hold even as numbers shrink, and the cliff shadow that protects them also limits their room to maneuver. Back in the bunker beneath Odessa, the operator wipes sweat from his brow as a critical number flashes on his display. 20 seconds to target is not presented as distance but as pressure, because at this point, every correction risks exposure. The script contrasts predators, describing Russia as a cheetah built for speed, and Ukraine as a fox built for angles and patience, framing the engagement as hide and seek, where agility beats raw chase. That metaphor matters because it reframes loss tolerance. A fox expects attrition and plans for it, while a cheetah expects a clean sprint and struggles when the quarry fragments. As the sky fills with money, the Russian defense network escalates again. Millions of dollars of ammunition are hurled upward as batteries and crews hunt for small shapes that refuse to behave like aircraft. At 1929 local time, one OSA drone changes its electronic signature completely. Instead of broadcasting threat, it screams the identification code of a civilian passenger aircraft and plots a path that appears to intersect a local school. The bluff is framed as digital theater rather than recklessness, a calculated manipulation of rules of engagement designed to freeze a hierarchy that cannot afford the wrong headline. The effect ripples instantly. On radar screens in Sevastopol, confusion spreads as orders conflict and permissions collide. Systems from the long-range S-400 batteries to individual soldiers hesitate for seconds that feel like minutes, all eyes locked on a phantom civilian track that demands caution. Those seconds are the currency Ukraine needs. While commanders argue, the 4 real attack drones slip through the radar shadow of the cliffs and emerge undetected with a clean line of sight to the 40 sanatorium. The script treats this as the fulcrum moment, where attention becomes the scarce resource, and misallocated attention opens the gate wider than force ever could. Offshore, the Magura Befai-5 has not left the story. Now roughly 20 meters from the coast and tucked into the shadow of a grain freighter, it performs its final act. A single tight beam laser pulse arcs across the water. The image is intimate, almost tender. A machine reaching out to steady another at the last moment. The freighter's presence ties commerce to conflict again, reminding the viewer that civilian silhouettes are both shield and stake in this environment. In the bunker, 4 green boxes lock onto the thermal signature of the main hall. The operator's voice is described as calm and cold as he announces that the trap is sprung. The clock hits 1930 local time, and the bluff collapses as Russian commanders realize the deception. Rage replaces hesitation, and the Pantsir systems come fully alive. 30mm cannons open up, spitting a wall of steel at thousands of rounds per minute, filling the air with explosive shells designed to shred aircraft. The script emphasizes the density of fire to heighten contrast with what follows, because evasion is not the chosen response. The 4 OSA drones do not scatter. They converge. The narration lingers on that choice, framing it as a refusal to play the defender's game. They dive through the curtain of fire in formation, lining up on a single point of attack, the main hall of the sanatorium. One drone, the one whose targeting was repaired at the last second, takes the lead and holds an unshakable lock on the heat bloom of a crowded banquet hall. The convergence transforms chaos into inevitability, and the audience is positioned to understand that the last defense has already failed, even as it grows louder. At the command, described as a baton pass rather than a trigger pull, the payloads detach. The drones themselves are demoted to couriers as 4 1.5-pound shaped charges snap free, fins deploying as they begin a terminal dive at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. The drones bank hard and turn back toward the sea, toward the Magura, waiting in shipping lanes, their role complete. The separation matters because it undercuts the defender's last hope. Killing the carrier no longer kills the weapon, and the focus shifts to physics and timing rather than electronics. Inside the sanatorium, the party becomes a study in disbelief. The roar of Pantsir cannons drowns conversation as a Spetsnaz commander shouts conflicting orders, and a high-ranking guest drops a glass that shatters on marble. The script emphasizes the gap between jamming confidence and kinetic reality, noting that the warheads care nothing for interference because they carry no electronics to fry. They are guided by momentum and geometry, indifferent to noise. That indifference is the true antagonist here, because it cannot be negotiated with or persuaded to stop. The first warhead strikes the glass roof of the main hall, and the narration slows to describe mechanics. Armored glass vaporizes rather than shatters under hundreds of foot-pounds of force, and the shaped charge focuses its energy into a jet of molten metal at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. The jet punches through marble as if it were cardboard, a finger of man-made lightning, aimed precisely where heat was densest. The language is technical but visual, turning the impact into a process rather than a flash. The final charge strikes the special event hall dead center, reducing the meeting table and the plans upon it to ash. The script adds that the electromagnetic pulse from the blasts fries local radar systems, blinding a section of the Crimean coast in one stroke, tying destruction inside to blindness outside. Russian response units arrive into confusion rather than control. Fire crews fight secondary blazes fed by ruptured gas lines, while security teams secure corridors that no longer connect. Communications degrade as local radar nodes remain blind, forcing reliance on distant sensors with delayed feeds. Naval patrols pull back instinctively, unwilling to linger near a coast that just proved hostile to layered defenses. The withdrawal is not announced, but it is visible in gaps on maritime tracking display. The Black Sea Fleet shifts posture, conceding space without admitting why. That space matters. Within hours, Ukrainian planners register the effect not in wreckage, but in movement. Commercial traffic adjusts routes as warnings ripple outward, and the safe grain corridor quietly widens as patrol density thins. The script frames this as leverage earned by precision rather than mass, where a single strike reshapes behavior. The sea becomes less contested, not because ships were sunk, but because confidence was. Insurance algorithms and shipping captains respond to risk signals faster than statements, and the absence of patrols speaks louder than communiques. Inside Russia's command chain, the damage compounds. Plans discussed at the sanatorium vanish with the hall that held them, and redundancy proves thinner than expected. The loss is not just paper and screens, but time, as parallel teams attempt to reconstruct context from fragments. The narrative emphasizes that secrecy collapses under pressure. When a node is removed, the network reveals how much depended on it. For coastal operations, that dependency translates into caution, delays, and orders rewritten midstream. The operators who launched the strike do not celebrate at the site. In Odessa, deep underground, the Ukrainian team watches satellite feeds confirm what sensors already told them. The camera lingers on faces marked by fatigue rather than triumph. They track secondary fires, count surviving drones returning to sea, and log the moments when radar coverage drops offline. The emphasis is procedural. Success is measured, recorded, and banked for the next decision. Emotion stays contained, because the window that opened may close if mishandled. The ghost chain tactic earns its reputation in debriefs. Analysts note how misdirection outpaced suppression, how chaff and shadows forced expensive systems to fight illusions. The lesson is not novelty, but sequencing. Each layer forced a choice, and each choice cost seconds. Those seconds compounded into a corridor of opportunity that no single defense could close. The script reinforces that this was not improvisation but design, a chain whose strength lay in the order of its links. Russian defenses adapt quickly, but adaptation admits vulnerability. New rules appear around no-fire zones, electronic identification, and patrol geometry. Each rule reduces freedom of action, trading flexibility for safety. The script frames this as a tax imposed by the strike, paid daily in caution. Jets still launch, batteries still scan, but commanders now ask different questions before authorizing fire, aware that hesitation can be weaponized against them. On the water, the Magurov 5 slips back into anonymity, its role complete. It blends with traffic patterns that never stopped moving. The narrative highlights restraint. No pursuit, no chase, no signature to follow. Survival is treated as success equal to impact, because a system that returns can be used again. The sea absorbs the evidence, leaving investigators with fragments and timing rather than a target. The damaged coastline forces a recalculation of air defense posture. Batteries repositioned to cover blind arcs, thinning coverage elsewhere. The script underscores the zero-sum nature of coverage. Protecting one sector exposes another. For Ukraine, that redistribution is the outcome, not the ruin itself. The map matters more than the photograph, and the map now shows wider lanes where none existed the night before. As hours pass, the narrative tightens around cause and effect. A guest house strike becomes a maritime adjustment, which becomes an economic shift. The chain is traced backward to choices made in seconds by operators trusting instruments and training. The story avoids moralizing, focusing instead on mechanics. Precision created leverage, leverage created space, and space created options. Each step is clean, intentional, and difficult to reverse quickly. By the next evening, the coastline looks calm again, but it is a different calm. Patrols run shorter, sensors sweep wider, and decision loops lengthen. The sanatorium remains a dark silhouette against the water, a reminder that comfort zones can be mapped and exploited. The script closes on that image without commentary, allowing the sequence of actions to speak for itself. At 500 hours local time, 6 Beaver unmanned aerial vehicles lifted off from Keren and headed toward a Russian airbase north of Silvestol, an installation that usually feels untouchable because it shelters rare Beriev B-12 amphibious aircraft behind layered radar coverage and rigid procedure. On the Russian side, a Tor M2 battery sat roughly 12 kilometers away, already awake, already scanning, and within moments its operator watched 6 fresh contacts bloom on the scope like sparks on dry tinder. What looked like a small raid was framed from the first second as a deliberate probe of how Russia's air defenses behave when the sky presents conflicting problems at once, under pressure. The arithmetic looked simple. Russian doctrine pushed 2 missiles per target for a high probability of kill, which meant the Tor crew believed they had enough interceptors to erase 6 slow drones from the sky. But the Ukrainians were not betting on survival through numbers. They were betting on attention, timing, and the fact that any crew can only solve so many problems at once before small errors stack into a miss. The plan had been built weeks earlier, stitched from satellite imagery, elevation data, and a mission logic that treated radar operators like humans with limited focus rather than like perfect machines with unlimited bandwidth. In this kind of fight, the first side to make the other side look twice at the same thing usually wins time, and time is everything. The first pair of beavers climbed early and climbed hard, pulling maximum current from their electric motors until their electromagnetic noise became a beacon that every nearby radar could taste. That noise was not an accident, it was the point. These two drones were written into the mission as decoys, meant to look aggressive and obvious, the way a bright flare pulls a guard's eyes away from the quiet approach. Their vector arced north and upward, and the higher they went, the louder they became, practically inviting a launch. They were not trying to hide. They were trying to consume missiles, consume attention, and shape the next decisions that would be made in the dark. Even their climb rate was a message. Commit to us now, or regret it later. 30 seconds later, the second pair launched near Berislav and did the opposite of dramatic. They stayed low, moving south in a line that looked almost indifferent, their thermal cameras turning the pre-dawn world into a calm map of heat and shadow while they conserved altitude for later. The final pair did not rush at all. Engines warmed, but their motion waited on a timer set long before sunrise. The kind of delayed release that only works when the mission planner trusts clocks more than adrenaline. In the air, each pair took a different vector, so the Tor crew did not see one problem, but three problems that refused to share a single solution. That staggered rhythm meant every response the Tor made would arrive slightly late to the problem that mattered most. On the Tor display, the northern pair rose to about 500 meters. The middle pair held around 100 meters, and the southern pair turned southwest, away from Crimea and away from anything that looked like a sensible target. That strange southern turn was the first clue that this was not a straight raid, but a choreography built to drag the battery's attention across the compass. The Tor commander faced the choice that every manual pretends is easy. Engage the loudest targets first, or hold missiles for the ones that might matter later. With doctrine whispering confidence and the decoys practically shouting for it, the decision tilted north. Even before the first launch, the Ukrainians had already made the battery argue with its own assumptions. The launcher spun, elevated, and fired two 9M338 missiles at the loud northern pair. For the first seconds, those weapons flew under ground guidance, climbing into a geometry that assumes targets keep altitude and keep logic. Then the Seekers went active, X-band radar flooding the air as the missiles tried to lock. The Beavers had been waiting for that switch because their radar warning receivers could hear the change from search pulses to track pulses like a heartbeat spike. And that spike was the signal. The instant the guidance shifted, the decoys stopped being targets and became problems, forcing the interceptors to chase them into a part of the envelope that had been engineered for aircraft, not for drones that weaponize altitude like a trapdoor. The dive was not graceful. It was a sudden drop that forced the missiles into steep pursuit through denser air, and the missiles were not happy about it. Designed for higher intercepts, they now had to pull extreme turns, their control surfaces straining as the autopilot demanded maneuvers near the edge of the airframe's tolerance. By the time the Beavers leveled near 20 meters, low enough that street signs would have mattered if there were any, the Seekers were staring into a cluttered world. The missiles had been built to pick clean shapes against empty sky, but now every fence post, roof edge, and puddle offered a competing reflection, and the drones were counting on that confusion like it was armor. Doppler filters tried to separate moving targets from the stationary landscape, but at high speed, the missile's own motion made the math cruel. The returns changed too fast to classify cleanly, like trying to read fine print while sprinting, and the guidance computer began rejecting what it could not confirm. In a few seconds, the Seekers could not validate a track, and onboard logic concluded that continuing was more dangerous than quitting. Roughly a dozen seconds after going active, both missiles initiated self-destruct, ending as two expensive flashes that solved nothing. For the Tor crew, it felt like an impossible miss against slow drones. For the attack plan, it was proof that physics, not stealth, could be used as a lever. The Tor crew snapped attention toward the southern pair. because those were the ones that had started behaving wrong, and suddenly they were also the ones that seemed to disappear. The drones had not vanished. They had slipped into a blind corridor created by terrain. The Tor radar sat on a slight rise with strong coverage in most directions. Yet to the southwest, a gentle valley carved a radar shadow beginning a few kilometers out, a place where line of sight breaks and the screen grows quiet. The corridor was narrow at ground level and narrowed further with altitude, which meant it could be used only by an aircraft disciplined enough to fly exactly where the map said and nowhere else, without improvisation. Ukrainian operators had found the usable band by studying elevation maps and satellite photos for weeks, measuring where the radar line would fail and where it would recover. The result was a narrow lane about 400 meters wide in lateral space, usable only between roughly 30 and 50 meters above ground. Fly higher and the Tor sees you. Fly lower and trees and buildings create their own hazards and their own unpredictable masking. The southern pair threaded the lane at about 35 meters, guided by memorized GPS coordinates like a ritual, because a drift of a couple hundred meters could have turned invisibility into a spotlight. The most dangerous part of the corridor was not the enemy, it was precision itself. While the commander hunted the missing southern returns, the middle pair drew fire. 2 more missiles launched, this time shaped for low-altitude intercept, the kind of profile meant to catch cruise missiles skimming flat. The middle beavers responded with a move that no air defense syllabus expects from cheap drones. They turned directly toward the Tor launcher and accelerated, diving to build speed and collapsing distance on purpose. The reason was not bravado, it was minimum engagement range. For the Tor, that boundary sat at roughly 1 kilometer, and inside it, the missiles could not safely arm in time, because safety protocols are designed to protect the launcher, even if it means letting a target slip through. The drones were not dodging the system, they were rushing into its blind handshake. Inside that 1 kilometer bubble, the missile's options narrowed, and the geometry turned hostile. Already programmed to meet targets around 3 kilometers out, the weapons had to recalculate, while the drones closed fast toward the launch point instead of away from it. One missile tried to bend the rules, pulling so hard that its structure failed and it tumbled, a heavy dart losing the control surfaces that make it a weapon. The other missile met a different constraint. Continuing pursuit risked flying over its own battery, and the safety logic refused to let a warhead threaten the launcher that fired it. It initiated self-destruct, roughly 800 meters from the Tor position, close enough that the crew felt the blast wave and understood they had been forced into a no-win corner. The surviving beavers crossed into occupied southern Ukraine at 517 hours, and the character of the fight changed immediately. What had been a localized duel with a single Tor battery expanded into a layered environment built to punish anything that slipped through. Near Novokakhovka, a Buk M3 battery had already been tracking the drones for several minutes, using its 9S36 radar to follow their heat signatures rather than their radar reflections. This was not a surprised unit reacting late. It was a prepared position with crews accustomed to hunting drones, crews who had learned the hard way that waiting politely for a clean radar picture was how you lost targets. The Buk commander did not bother with a visible search phase. Missiles left the rails almost flat, accelerating horizontally at treetop height instead of arcing upward, a profile that looks wrong until you understand the trick. In track via missile mode, the interceptor itself becomes a flying radar relay, pushing the battery's vision forward by tens of kilometers. The missile is not just a weapon, it is a sensor sprinting ahead of its own system, painting the target while racing toward it. For the drone operators watching live feeds, that meant an 18-second clock started ticking the moment the launch warning appeared, and those seconds were not negotiable. One beaver dove hard, spotting a grain elevator rising out of the landscape like a concrete cliff, with a narrow gap between it and its loading structure. The pilot aimed for that gap, trading altitude for speed, and trusting that a missile built to kill aircraft would struggle in tight geometry. The seeker stayed locked, transmitting updates every fraction of a second. But when the missile tried to follow through the gap, it found Earth instead of sky. The explosion punched into the ground, throwing smoke and debris upward. Through that cloud, 5 beavers emerged intact. One did not make it. A slab of metal, torn loose by the blast, clipped a wing and sent the drone cartwheeling into a field, ending in a small fireball that felt unfairly modest given the effort spent to stop it. The Buk commander watched his display with frustration rather than panic. His system could track dozens of targets and engage several at once, and yet the drones were making it look clumsy. The beavers began crossing paths deliberately, not near misses, but actual crossings that merged their returns into a single shape before separating again. Each merge forced the computer to recalculate identity, left versus right, high versus low, and each recalculation introduced a delay measured in just over a second. Electro-optical backups came online, but pre-dawn haze robbed them of clarity. Thermal imaging worked better, yet its effective range was limited, and by the time the drones appeared as pale dots against the cooler ground, they were already pressing the minimum engagement envelope. The Buk crew made the professional decision to go quiet, not because the system was broken or jammed, but because continuing to emit would not change the outcome. The radio report was brief and honest. 5 unmanned aerial vehicles continuing south, unable to engage due to technical limitations. In military language, that phrasing means the opponent found a way around the rules you were taught to trust. At 535 hours, the remaining drones entered the domain of an S-400 battery, positioned near Sefesta, a system built to reach hundreds of kilometers and erase ballistic threats long before they become local problems. Its 92 N6E radar is famous for sensitivity, and its 48 N6DM missiles are built to pull violent turns at extreme speed. Against aircraft and missiles, it is overwhelming. Against slow drones, it carries a quiet flaw, a velocity gate filter written to ignore anything moving below 100 kilometers per hour. A shortcut meant to keep birds and weather from cluttering the screen. The code was hard set years earlier, and no one expected it to matter. At 541 hours, an unexpected variable entered the equation. A Russian military transport flight, carrying 180 troops, began its descent towards Silvastol along the same approach path the beavers needed to follow. Air defense safety protocols forbade engagements within several kilometers of a friendly transponder, rules written to prevent disasters that end careers and start wars. The drones tucked themselves into the aircraft's approach lane, not dangerously close, but close enough that any missile launch would trigger every automated safeguard in the network. For 8 minutes, the beavers flew with a shield made of regulations and liability, while commanders argued over radios and air traffic controllers demanded reasons before diverting a routine flight. By the time voices stopped overlapping and decisions finally aligned, the drones had slipped clear of the S-400's engagement zone and accelerated toward Kachcha. The transport landed without incident, its crew unaware that it had been the most effective countermeasure in the air defense network that morning. Ahead, a Pantsir S-1 rolled into position at 546 hours, still unfolding stabilizing jacks as its radar searched. The commander ordered fire from the wheels, accepting reduced accuracy because some chance was better than none. This was not doctrine, it was triage. The Pantsir's first missile veered off almost immediately, its guidance confused by the unstabilized platform, and self-destructed after a short, useless flight. The second missile tracked better and caught 2 beavers in quick succession, turning them into falling debris before they could maneuver clear. With the drones now inside the missile envelope, the twin 30mm cannons took over, hurling tracers into the sky in long bursts, meant to create an impenetrable wall. The beavers refused to cooperate. They did not fly through the fire. They slipped around it, changing altitude and vector unpredictably while the vehicle rocked under recoil and the targeting reticle danced like it was alive. 2 minutes of continuous fire burned through roughly 800 rounds without a single confirmed hit. Then, 10 seconds later, one beaver pitched into a terminal dive. From a control room far away, an operator centered crosshairs on a Bereev B-12 sitting defenseless on the apron. its distinctive wings catching the first light of morning. The dive angle tightened to about 40 degrees, speed building past 200 kilometers per hour, and the drone's KZ-6-shaped charge focused its energy into a narrow jet that did not explode outward so much as punch forward, cutting through aluminum skin, fuel tanks, and into nearby maintenance assets that should never have been left in place. The shaped charge did not bloom outward like a movie explosion. It focused inward, collapsing all its force into a molten jet that cut through the BE-12, as if the aircraft were thin foil instead of metal. Fuel flashed instantly, and the blast jumped sideways into nearby ground equipment packed with aviation fuel that no one had bothered to move. The fireball rolled outward across the apron, bright enough to bleach the camera feed white for a fraction of a second. Shockwaves slapped the airbase, and debris began falling before the sound finished arriving. For the Pantsir crew, the target they were protecting simply ceased to exist in one violent, irreversible moment. Before the smoke could settle, a second beaver struck. This one came in lower and faster, angling toward an Mi-8 helicopter parked nearby. The impact was less visually dramatic at first, but far more lethal in effect. The shaped charge punched directly into stored ammunition, and within seconds the helicopter became a fountain of secondary detonations. 12.7mm rounds cooked off in all directions, snapping and cracking through the air like a thunderstorm made of metal. Several of those rounds slammed into the Pantsir's radar array, shredding sensitive components and blinding the system mid-engagement. The last functioning eye at Kachcha went dark. Then the final dive began. The last beaver pitched forward and accelerated toward the second bereaved B-12, which sat untouched but exposed, its crew long gone and its defenses non-existent. With no radar tracking it and no guns able to follow, the aircraft might as well have been a static target on a range. The drone held its line through light turbulence from rising heat, adjusted slightly to compensate for wind pushed by the fires, and committed. Seconds later, the shaped charge detonated on impact, repeating the same precise, brutal physics. The second aircraft ruptured, collapsed, and burned, sealing the fate of the entire detachment. For Russian air defense crews watching the feeds and hearing reports cascade upward, the sequence felt unreal. Multiple systems had engaged, missiles had flown, guns had fired, and yet inexpensive drones had crossed layer after layer by exploiting geometry, timing, and rules written for another era. No jamming had been used. No stealth coatings had been involved. Every success came from understanding how radar sees, how missiles think, and how humans respond under pressure when confronted with simultaneous problems. The loss of the aircraft was not just material. It was a demonstration that the defensive architecture itself could be bent until it broke. On the Ukrainian side, operators did not celebrate. They watched data streams, checked timestamps, and confirmed that no friendly systems had been compromised by the engagement. The mission logs showed exactly what planners had hoped to prove: that layered defenses behave like layered puzzles, and that solving them does not require overpowering every piece. It requires forcing each layer to answer a question it was never designed to face. From the first electromagnetic decoy to the final terminal dive, every step had been about narrowing options until the defender chose the only response left, even when that response led directly to failure. The destruction at Kachcha rippled outward through command channels within minutes. Aircraft that had been considered low-risk assets were suddenly reclassified as vulnerable. Maintenance procedures were questioned. Air defense commanders demanded explanations from software engineers about filters and safety gates that had seemed harmless on paper. None of those conversations could change what had already happened. The drones had passed through the network in sequence, each engagement shaping the next, until the final layer faced an attacker it could neither see clearly nor safely engage. The base was quiet again, but the silence felt different, heavier, as if something fundamental had shifted. From a tactical perspective, the attack was brief. From a systems perspective, it was exhaustive. Every major defensive component in the region had been touched, forced to reveal its assumptions under stress. The Tor had been dragged into clutter, the book had been overloaded with ambiguity. The S-400 had been undermined by its own filters and safety logic. The Pantsir had arrived too late and too unstable to matter. None of these systems failed in isolation. They failed because the fight never allowed them to operate in isolation, chaining their responses together until small limitations compounded into decisive gaps. In a fight defined by advanced systems and massive budgets, outcomes can still hinge on understanding terrain, software defaults, and the human tendency to focus on the loudest threat first. This operation ended when the final beaver disappeared from the feed, its mission complete. Nothing more was required, see it. The objective had never been survival or showmanship. It had been demonstration through action, using real systems under real conditions to expose how layered defenses behave when pressured from multiple directions at once. When the last flames died down on the apron at Kachcha, the message remained intact, written not in words, but in wreckage, timing logs, and radar gaps that could not be unseen.